Make sure it's running. Are we going to do it? Okay, good. Okay. Before we start, oh, that is my other class. Bless you. Hostility. Before we start, any questions from you guys about anything? First paper is, just to remind you guys, next Wednesday. Yeah, that's right. Next Wednesday. The default topic is up on Blackboard. It's about the movement west. Again, you don't have to do that default topic. Regardless of whether you do the default topic or not, do bring in an outside source or two. You can just use the book, but that will be like, minimum requirement. You bring in outside sources and use, stuff from beyond the book. That'll get you some extra points. Yeah, that's all I got. If you want to do something besides the default topic, let me know so it's not something that's too broad. Oh, I'd prefer that you print it out and bring it in. If you don't have the capability of doing that, which you should be able to print it out at the little, I guess, library or whatever you'd call it here. But sometimes that's screwy too. You can just email it to me. Preferably at my Francis Marion account. So I can just grade it that way. But yeah, if you could print it out and bring it in, that'd be great. For you online folks, just email it to me, because obviously that'd be a lot of work. But yeah, that's I don't have any kind of like Blackboard Turnitin system, because I've used that before, and it's just more work for everybody. Okay, anything else? Okay. Yeah, because actually the Blackboard Turnitin system, if like, let's say 5 people turn it in, and then I download it, and then a 6th person turns it in, I have to download it again with all the 5 that were already in there, including the 6th one. So it's like, it's really inefficient. So yeah, just email them to me if you can't print them out. But if you can print them out, please do. That's the preferred for you guys. Because otherwise my email is going to be flooded, because I've got 2 online classes anyway, and then this class, and then 2 other classes. So if you can physically hand them to me, all the best. If not, fine. Don't let the syllabus is a little aggressive about you guys emailing them to me. That's the other professor. Don't worry too much about that. I certainly prefer it, but I'm not going to count off for it. Okay. And also just to remind you guys, which I'll tell you guys again next week. So yeah, the paper is next Wednesday, and the week after that is Francis Marion spring break, so I ain't going to be here. So my classes are going to be off the week after next. And I assume other Francis Marion professors are going to have that week off. So that's going to be our spring break. That's when I'll be doing a bunch of grading, obviously. So yeah. All right, back to the notes. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know. And my email is always open for anything else. So, we ended on this. Statue of Liberty, the tired, poor, huddled masses. And the Statue of Liberty being, 10 years behind schedule, and then when it arrived, We good? We want to carry on a conversation? Great. It's not a good room for that, especially when I'm trying to record for online. Yeah, the Statue of Liberty was kind of a mess. It got here late, and then even then, we didn't have a platform for it. But despite the plaque at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty supposedly welcoming immigrants from all walks of life in, there was a lot of anti-immigrant thought and, action here in the United States. Industrialists wanted them in because, hey, they could pay them less. Other workers saw them as a threat to their jobs, creating higher competition, driving down wages, and, lots of anti-Semitism especially. New levels of racism because, of course, and this one I mentioned here at the end last time, of like, oh no, there's 70 million people in China starving and they're going to try to come here to not starve. Better watch out. It's like, what? Those don't really go together. So there was this debate on whether Catholics and Jews could be considered white, and so now as more ethnic groups came from Eastern Europe, it was the idea of whether a group was white or not was more about their ethnic group and religion than the actual color of their skin. See, it was a whole thing. And we're going to discuss this in the next slide, this idea of racial inferiority, and the evolutionary scale, which isn't a thing within humanity because we're all the same species. In fact, there's more divergence within a race of people than there is among the different races of people. Like, there's more genetic diversity in, say, African Americans because Africa's where humanity came from than within, between Asians and Europeans because of the bottlenecking of genes after humans left Africa. Just a little science for you there. Oh, it's more anti-Semitism to end up. All right, let's talk about some awful stuff. So to start out with, there was this idea of nativism, that the foreigners pose a serious danger to one's native society and culture. I will say that this was true in one case, to the Native Americans. Their native society and culture was very much destroyed due to immigrants or, settlers coming over from other nations and destroying their way of life and most of their people. I could say nativism, it certainly was true in one case. But this was, of course, the, quote, native Anglo-American people and their response to Eastern Europeans coming over. They believed that Southern European, Semitic, and Slavic races didn't fit into the community of race that created the United States. So there was the Immigration Restriction League, the American Protective Association, lobbied to restrict the immigration, and in the case of the American Protective League, reduce the rights of Catholics in America. I'll get into that latter bit in a little bit if you're not familiar with why that's a big deal. If you know anything about England and Ireland. You probably know why, but we'll get into that. Also, eugenics. Who boy, they liked them some eugenics in the late 1800s. This idea that advocated biological engineering, this pseudoscience that, again, it's weird that you look at some of this stuff in the late 1800s and we look back now and say, wow, that was weird and dumb and horrifying. And then you have some weirdos today that are like, yeah, no, this was legit. Like, no, what, how, why? People that were about this wanted selective breeding of desirable races to counter the rapid population growth of useless races. They wanted to institutionalize those that were seen unfit, sterilize those considered mentally impaired, and licensing and regulation of marriages to promote better breeding. You know, typical dystopia. Now, there were those that were less harsh. They wanted some level of assimilation with immigrants, education, adoption of American rituals and holidays. 1892, American schools adopted the Pledge of Allegiance, extolling American virtues like liberty and justice for all. The one nation under God didn't exist until the 1950s. That's when we were, fighting the USSR, and the USSR was notably seen as a godless nation, so we had to be as opposite of them as possible. A lot of older immigrants never quite caught on with learning English, though many of them did try. I want to mention, if you're familiar with, say, pre-World War II, you might recognize a lot of this. And let's just say 1930s Germany didn't get these ideas from nowhere. They look back in history and are like, these are some pretty good ideas. Let's use that. So they came from somewhere, and the somewhere was eugenicists in the United States. So, So keep out the Catholics, keep out, I'm guessing that's the Irish, and keep out the, my brain just shut off there. Communists. So we have the Mafia in New Orleans, anarchists in Chicago, socialists in New York, and we've just got a bunch of European immigrants, Polish vagabond, what's that next one? German socialist, Italian brigand. I like how the Italian brigand really looks like he's from like the Renaissance fair. English convict. I don't know who that next dude is, but he's got a monkey. That's pretty rad. Russian anarchist. Again, dude's not labeled, but he's got a damn bear. Look at this guy. He's got a bear. That's pretty cool. But I like how among all these like scary types we've got, where's my mouse? There it is. Here in the back, we've got Irish pauper. It's like, oh no, we've got poor Irish people. They're so scary. I mean, vagabond just means, they're people that don't really have a home. They just wander. Oh no, it's so scary. It's just as bad as literal brigands that will stab you in the street. Yeah. Real caring there with literally the Statue of Liberty in the background. Here's a good image, again from Puck. I seem to have never gotten a good image where Puck was clearly visible. You've got these business leaders, or I guess more social leaders, because the business leaders wanted the immigrants to come in so they could pay them very little to do work. Where they're, holding their noses and telling the dirty, poor immigrants to go back home. but then you see their shadows representing their ancestors who were also poor, dirty immigrants just a few generations ago. So, hypocrisy writ large. Here is why people in America were so weird about Catholicism. There was this idea, and again, if you've taken my 103 course, there was this idea that Catholics were supposed to be beholden to the Pope before anyone else. So if you got Catholic people in Washington, then the Pope could just control them with his Pope phone, I guess. And then the United States would just fall to the papacy? I don't know. It's very weird. The hand that would rob us of our freedom. Because clearly we are like at war with the Pope in this weird analogy. I don't know what that's about. But like this fear of the papacy literally taking over the United States persisted until JFK. Like there was a whole campaign against John Kennedy as he was trying to become president. They're like, oh, well, he's a Catholic, so if he becomes president, the Pope's going to be in charge. And he became president. It's like, oh, I guess the Pope's not in charge. So, I don't know. Or maybe he was, and that's why he was shot. Dun, 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 conspiracy. I don't know. But that's the whole thing. By the way, Biden's Catholic, so I guess the Pope's in charge now. Just FYI. I don't know why. Oh, there it is. My professor has this sign in his office because he's Irish, so decided to save that. Help wanted, but not Irish because we're anti-immigrant. What else we have? Oh, I don't know if this was later, like closer to World War II, but I guess this would be in California. It's the white man's neighborhood. Here, let me point at this sign so I can be extra racist. That could be my grandmother. Oh, God, I forgot this sign. This is such a bad sign. So this light flashes every 15 seconds. In 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes to the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded criminals, and other defectives. Okay? Some people are born to be a burden on the rest. This light flashes every 16 seconds. Every 16 seconds, a person is born in the United States. This light flashes every 7.5 minutes. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States. Born in the United States, and will have ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come within this class. And this is the Fitter Families Contest, which I actually have another image for. It's a whole weird eugenics thing. Hey, look, it's literally the eugenics building. So, meanwhile, in Kansas, how Kansas develops Fitter Families, a remarkable experiment in eugenics. Popular Science Monthly. By Arthur Kaffer, U.S. Senator from Kansas. So, here's the eugenics building at Kansas Free Fair where families are judged and registered. Seated at the center is a Fitter Family surrounded by examiners. That's horrifying. Feels like a Fallout experiment where you go in and you never come out. Charles materials from any sources, organisms a harmonious entity. Yeah. Just self-direction of human evolution. That's not how evolution works. Here's some, I don't remember the term for it, but it's part of eugenics, but where you like measure the skull or something. It's a specific term for like measuring the skull to see how intelligent a person is or some nonsense. And this is like a bunch of other stuff, like they have lighter skin color or less frizzy hair. It's like, what? Obviously, this is specific about black folks because, you know, extra racism on top of eugenics. And if we had simply sterilized this lady, we wouldn't have had all these horrible children. 92% of her descendants, 64 were mentally diseased, 174 were sex perverts, 196 were illegitimates, which like, okay, what does that really have to do with anything? 142 were paupers, which is the government's fault. 77 were criminals and murderers, which probably also the government's fault because they didn't have any money and nowhere to go, so they had to become criminals. So yeah, this is my favorite one, Martin Killicack. We have, this is the multiverse theory of eugenics. So in the dark timeline, he died with a feeble-minded tavern girl who is horrifying. She bore a son known as Old Horror, who had 10 children. And from Old Horror's 10 children came hundreds of the lowest types of human beings. So there's the dark timeline. But if we go to the light timeline, he married a worthy Quakeress. I didn't know that was a term. She had 7 upright, worthy children who were all clearly born with hats. And from the 7 worthy children came hundreds of the highest types of human beings, which is to say more Quakers. Yeah, so in other words, make sure you look for someone with a hat. Also, I guess the origin of Two-Face? I don't know. It's got the bi-symmetrical thing going on. Yeah, I like this one. Right, on to assimilation. I didn't want to end on eugenics last time. So assimilation, you couldn't really become fully assimilated into a culture, but at the same time, the immigrants typically were not the same people they were when they left their home countries. Israel Zangwill, sorry, I'm used to doing the German pronunciation. English-American Jew portrayed the hope of assimilation in his play, The Melting Pot, which I'm sure you've at least heard the term The Melting Pot. It's very American propaganda. So it was this ideal of assimilation used in cartoons, business corporations, ceremonies, lessons in school classrooms, literally to this day. But it was mostly just an ideal, because you can't just like go to a new country and just become absorbed in this mishmash of a culture. You never really lose the cultural, religious, social, etc. Culture that you, or identity that you had. And even if you tried to fully assimilate with a culture, or at least if the immigrants try to fully assimilate with the culture here in America, there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment that would have made it difficult anyway, because, oh no, you look slightly different than the Anglo-American norm we're used to, so we're going to treat you like crap. So this was better summed up by sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois in his, the book doesn't mention if it's like a book or like a pamphlet, but in his, I'll assume it's a book, The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. So he described the two-ness of the blacks in America, the identity of their African heritage, past as slaves, and now as free citizens. I've got a longer quote in a picture, so I'll get to that in a minute. But he describes the double consciousness of African Americans in the United States and how this would also exist to immigrants as well, where their past and their heritage from their home country would exist in tandem with their current situation and their sort of attempts at assimilating. So the book mentions that rather than a melting pot where everybody becomes this homogeneous whole, it's more of a vegetable soup. Individuals in a collective broth as opposed to coming together to be the same. So you're still an individual even if you're sort of part of the same group. And I've got this great image of the melting pot. It looks like the Statue of Liberty is conducting some horrible ritual to eat all the people. That or like Kirby's Ultimate Smash in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, where he just throws everybody in the pot. I don't know what it is in Smash Ultimate. I've not played that. So here's Zangwill. America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all races of Europe are melting and reforming. The real American has not yet arrived. He is only in the crucible. I tell you, he will be the fusion of all races. I don't know, Mr. Zangwill, we still got a whole lot of anti-immigrant sentiment and a whole lot of racism to get through first. So here we have a quote from W.B. Du Bois, who we will speak about in greater detail in the next chapter. This peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. One feels this two-ness, an American, say an African American, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals, and one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So it's not just like having two selves, one could say. You know, where you've come from and where you are now. But like they're so different, you feel like you're being torn apart sometimes. It's quite an interesting way of putting it, and Du Bois was, I suppose he's long gone, was very intelligent and really knew what he was talking about. So we'll talk more about him next chapter. Okay, rest of the chapter is city stuff. So, again, a lot of numbers here, but mostly just to show you guys how quickly things grew. Population in the United States quadrupled in 50 years, but the urban population increased by a factor of 7. So that is to say, most people went to the cities. 1870, 1 in 5 Americans lived in a city over 8,000 people. 1900, 1 in 3 Americans lived in a city that size. So again, a lot of Americans are moving to the cities. That's what we're looking at. Not only were new cities popping up, but cities themselves were growing. Small towns becoming sprawling cities within a few years. The cities themselves were changing physically, skyscrapers reaching upwards, electric lights, water, gas pipes, sewers, subways, etc. And while a lot of times the people during a time of such change wouldn't really notice it until kind of the end. Like, for example, having grown up in the 90s, when the internet was really becoming a thing, it was kind of hard to really see where it was going. And now it's like, oh no, it's just kind of everywhere, and you do everything through the internet. But back then, they saw it, which I guess when it's literally physically growing up around you, it's hard to miss. Reverend Samuel Lane Loomis, who was a school teacher, he said, "We live in the age of great cities. Each successive year finds a stronger and more irresistible current sweeping in towards the centers of life." And this is actually something we'll be getting to pretty soon in my European history course, where the cities start growing larger and the populations start moving in towards the cities, which then cause the cities to have to grow larger in order to accommodate more people. And as the cities grow larger, it creates more jobs because you need construction to make the cities get bigger. So as more jobs are created, more people move in to create more jobs, and more people moving in makes the city grow larger, and it just creates this cycle. There are some interesting, this is actually probably one of the better pictures, some interesting images from this era, because you have, actually I need to use the mouse because online class, you have these old, just like cars or delivery vans. But then right here beside it, you have horse-drawn carriages, because at this time, the cars weren't that great. They weren't that efficient, and there weren't that many petrol stations around. So a horse and buggy was just as efficient as an actual vehicle. So they existed side by side for a fair few years. Here's another existing side by side. You've got these rail cars. I think these were actually horse-drawn rail cars. I can't see the front of them. So this is a bit of an older town. Another older one here. Get to, oh, here's a fun one. So here's a dude working on, it's a building that's taller than the Chrysler building, at least. Just hanging out, sitting out on a platform. He's got gloves, I guess. That's about it. You didn't have safety harnesses back in the late 1800s. I will say this, at least he's not using rivets. Because when you were using rivets, they had them in like it's basically a bucket. And it was, they heated them till they were white hot, and they'd grab them with a pair of tongs and throw them to you. And you'd be wearing these big heavy gloves, and you'd catch them with your hand and then rivet them into place while they were still white hot. And if you missed, there's a white hot piece of metal coming at you. And I wouldn't want to be there while there's a wet, white hot piece of metal coming at me. So at least they're not using rivets. Rivets are mostly used for shipbuilding anyway. So, part of the Civil War was mostly commerce. We had port cities, all the big ones, New York, Boston, San Francisco, New Orleans, etc. Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Detroit were near large bodies of water, the Great Lakes or Mississippi River. And then with railways extending further into the mainland United States, other cities began cropping up. Further helping Chicago, actually, Chicago is less of a shipping city, more of a rail city now. Well, at that point and also now. So as we mentioned at the beginning of the chapter, these cities grew not just from immigration, but also from internal migration. Those that were driven off their farms, whether they left because they wanted to or they just lost their farms entirely, they went to the cities to try to seek their fortune. So we had electricity, structural steel. We'll talk about all this in greater detail. Plumbing allowed for the cities to grow and expand, which gradually decreased the dangers of congested living like fire and disease, which we'll talk about those in great detail later as well. Because, hoo boy, cities were dangerous. Obviously, with the farmers leaving the South, there were many black farmers who left as well because, sharecropping was just awful, so they were on their way out. But of course, they also had to deal with racial segregation because, it was everywhere. Between 1890 and 1914, 485,000 blacks left the South, though the North was hardly this promised land that they thought it was going to be. So like with the foreign immigrants, they faced discrimination and were often pushed into black-only ghettos, and they had to rely on each other to get by, so they basically faced the same issues that the immigrants did. So here we have where the cities largely are, California, the Northeast. Obviously, the Carolinas, we didn't have crap for cities. Georgia and Alabama did, but just because of Atlanta and Birmingham. I don't know if Savannah existed yet. If it did, it was kind of a city. We still had Charleston, but most people lived in the countryside. And then railroads again. Glad that it's telling us which way is north. Very helpful. There we go. Thank you for that. Here's some, this is a fairly interesting map here. It's showing us the growth of cities. The red dots are cities that existed before 1880. Blue is cities after 1880. And then the red with the little black there is the growth of the cities after 1880. So those that exploded in population. And then the golden circle here is this urban industrial core, which again, having driven and taken a train now. Where's my mouse? From here up through this region. Between Chicago and say Pittsburgh, it's cow fields. But between Richmond and say Boston, it's all city. It's just one big urban area. So that's all industrialized, but when you go the other way, it's a lot more spread out. All right, so let's talk about the actual growth of the cities, physically. So, before 1860, we've got a couple of specific points in time to talk about. So before the Civil War, Buildings were constructed of stone and brick. They only got to about 4 or 5 stories. You couldn't get too big with stone and brick. And even as late as 1880, which is largely our turning point decade, usually the church steeples were the tallest structure in the city. You go into a new city, and it's the church steeple that's the tallest thing you're going to see. I mean, hell, I think still here in Lake City, the church is the tallest thing you're going to see on the skyline. As the city populations were going up, the land value went up as well, so architects had to deal with these small, expensive plots of land and put as many people on them as possible, so they had to start building upward. So they started using cast iron rather than stone and brick. Those buildings started reaching 10 stories, which I know when you think about big buildings, 10 stories isn't that big of a deal, unless you've taken the stairs, in which case 10 stories is a lot. These are known as cloud scrapers, but it wasn't long before structural steel came about and we got the proper skyscrapers. Skyscrapers reached 30 stories, began dominating the skylines, and with the invention of electric elevators and radiators, which allowed for heat to get to these upper stories, because if you're, say, on the 30th floor in New York City during the winter, it's going to be cold. And you can't have a fireplace up there because you're going to burn the whole building down. Also, the smoke's not going to be able to escape. Or if you're not on the 30th floor, say you're on the 25th floor and there's floors above you, you can't do anything with that. So radiators were very important to keep people warm. So this let the structures climb even higher than 30 stories. With transportation, the cities were able to sprawl outward as well. Previously, if you wanted to go to work, you had to walk or take, a horse-drawn carriage or a horse-drawn rail car. San Francisco, and then eventually Seattle and Chicago, had cable-driven trolley cars. I've actually got a picture of one. They were this weird kind of middle ground. Eventually, we had electric trolley cars, subways in New York. Structural steel allowed for large bridges, such as the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, to span rivers and then actually expand the scope of a city beyond the river. This also meant that the middle and upper class could actually just leave the city and live in suburban areas and then just commute to work, while working class people were trapped in the cities in a cycle of high rent and low wages because, that's just always how it works. So we do have a couple of images here of cast iron. There are still a few of these left around. They're mostly kept because the buildings are actually pretty nice to look at. Since they couldn't build especially high, they decided to make them pretty. Went very, very artsy with them. Oh, I forgot to talk about the water situation. Getting water to the tops of these buildings wasn't easy. I mean, they had water pumps to some degree, but it wasn't easy. In New York especially, they would often just build water towers on top of the buildings, and as long as the water was higher than the building, water pressure would be able to go to the entire building. It's gravity based. And a lot of New York City is actually lower than this. Is it a basin? It was a reservoir basin that they also drain water from. So there are buildings that they don't have these water towers on, and they draw water from this reservoir because they're lower than the reservoir. They use a lot of gravity-based water in New York City. It's strange. Anyway, there's again the first proper skyscraper, the Flatiron Building. Here's another taller, skinnier building. I think this is also in New York, or that might be Chicago. This one's got a nice mixture. You've got these smaller storefronts here. Actually, I should probably use a mouse since I'm doing online. There's my mouse, here it is. Right, storefronts here. In the back, there's a church steeple, which you can see is taller than these smaller buildings. But then as you go further on, you've got these slightly taller, not quite cloud scraper buildings, but then as you go to the back, these are proper skyscrapers. And then sometimes you just have a big ass building next to a cemetery. Oh, in case you've never seen a radiator before, because I'd never seen a radiator before I went to Ireland, because it doesn't really get cold enough around here for radiators. We just have like central air usually. So that's what a radiator looks like. They just run hot water through it, and because of the shape of it, it literally just radiates the heat from the hot water. There's a horse-drawn rail car, some rail cars and horses at the same time, because again, it didn't just like immediately shift from one to the other. There's a cable-driven rail car. Those were weird. You'd have like a destination at the other end, and it literally just like had a cable underneath, and it just pulled it. It just had like a generator, or not a generator, a motor on one end, and it just pulled them along. There's the electric cable cars. These terrify me. I'm scared of electricity, and when these things go along and they like hit a bump or something, that wheel at the top will usually bounce and come off the electric line. Then when it comes back up, it crackles, and that just, it causes primal fear in me. So don't like that. Anyway, here's one underground, and here is a New York subway. Oh, yeah, here's Brooklyn Bridge as it was originally. You had, at first I thought this was a rail line. Right, use the mouse. But looking at this, that looks like a cable car thing. So this might be a cable trolley thing, which is weird. I don't know. That's odd. Yeah, it's got a big old train line here in the middle, and then it's got just like walkways / poopways here on each side. I guess I'm sure there was a whole lot of work to make that into the roadway that it is now. Here's some children hanging out on the shoddy construction fire escape. Just everybody pile on, kids. This is more 1950s, but suburbia. Blech. Right. Speaking of suburbia, or not suburbia, the inner cities. Middle upper classes went to the small neighborhoods. working class were stuck in the cities, property values went up, the only way to survive was in these multifamily apartments or tenements. So not like an apartment we think of today where, you get your own place or you like have a roommate. This is where we have, this is legally defined as containing more than 3 families. More than 3 families in a single apartment. Typically poorly ventilated, filthy, dangerous, major issue of disease, which we'll get to. Also, very cramped, so if there was a fire, it got everybody. Also, they were sometimes a place of business. You could put some sewing machines or cigar rollers in there, and bam, you've got a sweatshop. And since they weren't technically factories, you could keep the wages low and not have to worry about factory regulations because they're not in a factory. Yay! Always exploit the working class. From the start. But hey, just because, factories have regulations doesn't mean factories aren't horrible places of death. We have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. 1911, Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York's Greenwich Village experienced a fire. So it happened on the 8th floor, spread up to the 9th and 10th. Fire engine ladders couldn't reach that high. So there's an oversight. Also, one of the exit doors on the 9th floor was locked to prevent workers from stealing material. Let me repeat that. One of the fire exit doors was locked. 146 people died, some leaping from windows, but most of them were trapped behind said locked door. Normally, I'd pull up a little video of this, but I'd like to get to the end of the material for the end of the semester, so we're not going to do that. But don't worry, I've got images. So here's a tenement. It was just like a one-room apartment. Everybody was crammed in there. I don't know what the constable's doing here, but here's another one. You hang out your clothes to dry, because obviously there was no kind of, washers and dryers didn't exist, but you also didn't have any kind of backyard to hang your clothes up in, so string them out through the window. Here's another view. Another tenement. The courtyard, as it's called. There's the basement. Or cellar. Same thing. That's trash, just a bunch of trash that just sort of flow down the steps. Sweatshop. Sweatshop. All right, so here's the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Their water is sort of reaching the windows, but that's not helping the people that are in there. Here's the people that jumped. Needless to say, hitting the concrete from 9 stories up, they didn't quite make it. Those that made it to the fire escapes also didn't quite make it because the fire either melted the fire escapes or the fire escapes were just so shoddy they fell. Here's the before and after. So you can see how many people were crammed in there and then what was left of the place after the fire finished burning. There's that second picture, but larger. So you can see what was just left of that whole workspace. Real quick, we'll see if anybody in here is awake. So a shirtwaist is like a part of a garment. Since this was a clothing company, what type of people do you think were largely employed there? Say that again? Well, some, yes, but who was usually employed at like clothing factories? Women. Most of the 146 people that died were young women. And this incident, this travesty on the case of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company caused New York to rally behind unions, and a lot more regulations were put into place to prevent this from ever happening again. So while this was horrific and tragic and obviously very, very terrible, the people did like stand up and take notice of this, and there were a lot of like important regulations put into place because of this. In part because it was a lot of young women that died, which, was terrible, but it certainly tugged at the sympathy of the people who saw it happen. And it was in the middle of like Greenwich Village, which, if I recall correctly, is like one of the heaviest populated places in New York. So they all saw it happening. All right, a couple more things about the cities. So poor diets, lack of decent sanitation, cramped conditions, loss of disease. Cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, tens of thousands of people died in the 1870s and 1880s. Nearly a quarter of American children born in cities never reached their first birthday. Getting decent running water was the best way to deal with this, but with everybody living in such a small space, it was very hard to meet demand. Like I said, with New York, they had those water towers or using the reservoir. Actually pumping water in from outside places or having like sanitation plants, that was very, very difficult. A lot of times they dump sewage into the rivers, and then they'd use those rivers to draw water from to bathe in and drink. Like, the Seine River in Paris, where cholera happened like every other week. Traffic, oh right. So, I said that a lot of the traffic was still horse-drawn carriages. Well, horses don't make, say, air pollution like a car does. They make another kind of pollution. Well, anybody want to hazard a guess as to what kind of pollution horses make? Methane. Well, they make methane, but they make a more immediate pollution, say, on the road. They make massive horse dumps. And the roads were largely unpaved, so when it rained, the dirt and the manure would mix, and it would make a horrible mess. And unfortunately, I don't have the picture, or at least not on this slide. I need to find it again. I had a picture of a horse-drawn carriage buried up to the axle in a mixture of mud and horse waste. Yeah, it was bad. So, yeah, I mean, air pollution is bad, but like when the roads are so full of horse crap you can't get through them, that's bad too. And then, of course, crime, cramped conditions, poor living conditions, dismal wages. You know, people that are desperate are going to turn to crime because you got to eat. U.S. murder rate quadrupled in 20 years, while those in Europe were in decline. New York city slums earned names like Bandit Roost, Hell's Kitchen, sewer rats, rot gang, assaulted unwary citizens, et cetera, et cetera. Notice representatives of cholera. I love these big, like, chunky signs. They're so much fun. Be temperate in eating and drinking. Avoid raw vegetables and unripe fruit, with like 7 different fonts too. Abstain from cold water when heated, and above all from ardent spirits. You know, and then the little finger. Do not sleep in sleep or sit in a draught of air. Avoid getting wet. Hey, you know, when boomers are like, hey, you should go outside and play in the street. You know, back before boomers were around, this is what playing in the street meant. Anybody see what else is in the street besides the kids? My last class didn't want to talk about it. That's a dead horse. The kids are sitting in the gutter right next to a dead horse. Because again, when everything was horse-drawn carriages, when your carriage broke down, your horse died, and dragging off a horse was a lot of work. It died, and they just left it there. There was usually like a sanitation workers in the city that would probably take care of it, kind of like they deal with roadkill today, but it usually would take a little while. So kids would come and poke at it until they came and got it. The best way they knew to deal with fever germs was just like burning crap in the street, because they didn't know any better. Oh, okay. We're almost done. We've got like 2 more slides. We've got like 2 more slides for this chapter. We'll do that next time, but I want to do a couple more pictures. So here's a river in Chicago full of sewage, or not sewage, chemicals from factories. So that's all real gross, right? But then this happens. The water's on fire, y'all. The water's on fire. This happened like 12 times. Don't do that. No. You bet. This happened so many times, they literally created the EPA because of this. And also, like the only, because there are so many chemicals in it. Yeah. And the only way to like pump water to put out fires near the river was to pump water from the river, which is on fire. So they just kind of had to let it burn. It was real bad. Anyway, here's Bandit's Roost. I showed you that picture before. You don't go down this alley. I think that's the rock gang. I don't know what this is. It's so weird. It's like...
It looks like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, like that house right there.
Yeah, it's like, why is this sitting next to a building? This looks like some old prospector's house. It's so weird. Here's a place where a bunch of people got murdered. Here's some gang members. Here's some more gang members. I got a mugshot in here somewhere, I think. Here's some dudes. Okay, we'll do political machines and city bosses next time, and then we'll finish up and do the next chapter. See y'all on Wednesday.